Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plotlines. I'm your host, Connor, and today we're going to talk about the legacy of Benedict XVI. And with me to discuss that is Dr. Jared Staudt. Um, Dr. Staudt has come on this podcast multiple times. Wants to talk about catechesis and wants to talk about beer and the culture around beer. Welcome back, Dr. Staudt.
Thank you for having me.
I noticed your article in Crisis Magazine, and that's what sparked my interest in interviewing on the subject. So, thank you for writing that article, and it's a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, absolutely. I certainly love Pope Benedict XVI and always happy to write about him and talk about him.
Yeah. What uh, what was your first reaction to learning of his death?
Well, it was very much anticipated. And you mentioned the article in Crisis Magazine, and I actually wrote that about 5 years ago.
Oh, okay.
So in a way, we were waiting, we were preparing, we knew that this was going to come. I remember even at his last Wednesday audience as Pope, before his resignation date, and I thought he looked like a skeleton even then. And obviously, some of us, and I include myself in this, we really felt kind of let down by his resignation because we loved him so much and he really was a great father to us. And I think we actually, some of us had to work through abandonment, those feelings. But when I saw him in that last Wednesday audience, I knew, gosh, he's not kidding when he says he just does not have the strength. I mean, it looks like you could just break him, like he's that frail. You could just snap, his arm or something. So in a way, it's surprising that he held out as long as he did. And even years ago, Archbishop Gainsfein said that he was a candle that was slowly kind of being snuffed out. But that was years ago. He said that.
Yeah.
And so it was not really a surprise, right? Cardinal Pell passing away yesterday, God rest his soul, was much more of a surprise because even though Cardinal Pell was 81, he still had more vigor to him than Pope Benedict XVI, of course, being much older, in his late 90s, versus early 80s. So yes, very very much anticipated, and yet it's still a momentous occasion when someone of his great stature passes to the next life.
Yeah. My reaction, it was also very similar, except for I didn't have as long of a sort of experience with his papacy. My experience was more sort of in the background of my childhood. I mean, uh, I was born in '99, so I didn't experience much sort of actively of his papacy, except for sort of the sort of casual changes, such as the editing of the English translation of the Missal, the
Hmm.
Missal of Paul VI. So that, yeah,
Well, there's certain people that will continue to even discover Benedict after his death. My confirmation saint is Pope Saint Pius X, and of course, a key figure in the liturgical renewal. And so, here I am, a kid in the 1990s. I was confirmed in 95 ish, around and that time. And so, looking 100 years earlier, not quite 100 years, but many decades earlier, to Pius X. And I think that Benedict will be an even larger reference point for people because Pius X is a great saint and, had a very strong faith, fighting against modernism, really trying to draw us more deeply into the liturgy and promoting Gregorian chant. So there are some strong parallels with Benedict's pontificate, and Pius X. But Benedict is just such a great intellectual figure, spiritual as well, but such a towering intellect that I think he'll be even much more influential in the long run, even than someone like Pius X.
interesting. Yeah. So can you explain sort of what theological sort of group he came from?
Certainly. So when he was in the seminary, right? And he started seminary in the 1930s, um, outside of Munich. So he was in the Munich Freising archdiocese, and of course his seminary studies were disrupted by the Nazis, and he was actually compelled during his seminary time to join an anti-aircraft unit. So he was, kind of like an auxiliary. He was not a soldier. He was an auxiliary,
Mhm.
just kind of helping with equipment and that kind of thing. But when he returned to his studies after the Second World War, after we captured him, actually he was an American POW at
Really?
the very end of the war. So when he was cleared and released by us, um, and returned to his studies, of obviously mid 1940s, he really was shaped deeply by his study of Saint Augustine. And of course, other figures, even in the liturgical movement. He was deeply influenced by Romano Guardini. So if you're familiar with Guardini's thought, right, that was a kind of early influence upon him. And he did study St. Thomas Aquinas during that time as well. But Augustine influenced him much more deeply than Aquinas, and really put his stamp on Benedict's thought early on. And so Benedict actually wrote his first doctoral thesis on the people of God in St. Augustine. And of course, that whole topic of the people of God was something that emerged strongly at the Second Vatican Council. So if you were to position him, let's say, before Vatican II, right, where would he have fallen? He was very sympathetic with the Nouvelle Theologie. It wouldn't be accurate to say that he was a major figure in the Nouvelle Theologie at that time, because he was just too young of a thinker, but he was very sympathetic with that group. And so what were they doing? They were returning to the sources. And for Benedict, that was Augustine, right? So the ressourcement, the returning to the sources, but also trying to speak into contemporary issues and to take the church's timeless theology and to make it accessible for people in the 20th century. And that was really a passion for Benedict. And he caused a stir as a young priest when he gave a talk on new paganism in the church. Just kind of looking at in the post-war period at people who still called themselves Catholics, sometimes even went to church, but were pretty much living like pagans, even though they were in the church. And so that's kind of what he was interested in, was getting deep into the tradition, but speaking to what was really happening in the church and being very attentive to the needs of Christians in the modern world. Now, I'm much more of a Thomist myself, but I appreciate those aspirations of the Nouvelle Theologie of going back to the sources and speaking to contemporary culture. I believe in both of those principles very strongly. The Nouvelle Theologie went off the rails a little bit by getting too much into modern philosophy, but I think Benedict, for the most part, avoided a lot of the pitfalls that we see some of the other figures of that movement falling into. Now, the big turning point in his life theologically absolutely was the Second Vatican Council. He was in his 30s, so he was a young priest when he was a peritus, an expert at Vatican II, a peritus for Cardinal Frings of Cologne. And Cardinal Frings was one of the most important bishops at the Second Vatican Council. And so Ratzinger urged him to propose that the fathers of the council draft their own documents. And so that was really a key turning point. And so Ratzinger had influence in that, and he was writing the speeches for the cardinal. And we now know more and more that Ratzinger actually helped to draft some of the council documents. For instance, Dei Verbum was a document that he had a very profound influence upon. He was involved in some of the other documents as well. And so coming out of the council, he was involved with the concilium movement, and that was a group of theologians. And you have guys like Rahner and Skillebeck, but you also had de Lubac and Congar, who were part of this as well, following the council, von Balthasar. And there was a split that happened in that movement because you had people like Ronner and Skillebex who were much more on the progressive side, and they saw the council more as a revolution in theology, as this opportunity to go farther and farther with the engagement of the modern world. And then you have others like de Lubac, Ratzinger, and Balthasar who saw that that progressive camp was going just off the rails. So you would have said before Vatican II and in the period immediately following Vatican II that Benedict was part of the progressive camp. But with that definitive split with Concilium happening in the early 70s, we would say that he was part of the Communio movement. So, and this was marked by the founding of the theological journal Communio. And so de Lubac, Balthasar, and Ratzinger were the key figures in that. And it's much more faithful to the actual vision of Vatican II. So the movement called Concilium, which means council, they once again they saw the council as a revolution that continued to unfold. The Communio group was really more faithful to the original vision of the Nouvelle Théologie, that is, engagement with the sources of Scripture and the tradition, especially the Church Fathers, and really speaking into the needs and concerns of modern culture at the same time. And so that is really the camp that we would say Benedict landed in theologically. And so if we're kind of looking back on his life as we are, we would say he's in the Communio movement of theology.
Were there other camps at the Second Vatican Council?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, there were other periti, these experts who were already working in a very progressive notion. I mean, Hans Kung, for instance, in one of the most humorous incidents in the council, wrote a speech for an African bishop in Latin, and the bishop actually didn't speak Latin, and so he called for women priests in the Latin speech. So the poor bishop didn't know what he was doing. And so, yeah, you had people like Hans Kung already at the council who were kind of way out ahead. And you had people like Ronner had a lot of influence at the council, and he was more progressive, but he was kind of holding it back a little bit too. And so you maybe couldn't see his cards very clearly at the council yet. And after the council, it became clear. So there were some people who were kind of more progressive. Ratzinger was on the progressive side, kind of wanting to push things along. Interestingly, there were Eastern Catholic bishops who were trying to push certain things so that they would not simply be forgotten. And so there were some important interventions from some Eastern Catholic bishops. And then, of course, I mean, we would look at the kind of traditionalist faction at the council, which very quickly became a minority. They were able to have some influence, particularly making interventions and getting some revisions of documents kind of pushed through, and also alerting Paul VI. Paul VI made some very significant interventions, even with the council documents themselves, which was very controversial, especially the ones in Lumen Gentium that Paul made. So Paul was clearly on the side of the progressives, and yet the traditionalists were able to kind of, whisper in his ear on some occasions. And the traditionalists were more aligned actually with some people in the Curia, like Cardinal Ottaviani. And so they did have some influence, but the traditionalists did not drive the agenda of the council by any means. They were kind of left behind, kind of picking up the pieces.
Yeah. How did Ratzinger's career move forward post Vatican II?
So he bounced around at a number of universities. He taught at Bonn, and then he actually moved a couple of places. He went to Tübingen, which was a very prominent theological position that he held there, but he was butting heads with Hans Kung at Tübingen. So he actually settled down at Regensburg, and he really wanted to stay in Regensburg for the remainder of his career, but was named to be the Archbishop of Munich. And he was pretty young, even when that appointment was made by Paul VI. He was pretty shocked. Wasn't sure he wanted to accept, but he really, and this is consistent in his career, he really felt like he was making a tremendous sacrifice of his theological career in service of the church. He felt that very strongly, that there was a higher calling. I mean, he literally wanted to just continue to give lectures in theology, and he had in his mind even a great scope of writing a complete work of systematic theology. So he wanted to write like a whole coherent overview of theology. And so he made a sacrifice of that desire. And he was only in Munich, I believe it was 5 years. Paul VI died. He was made a cardinal by Paul VI. So he did participate in the conclave of John Paul I and then also of John Paul II. And he actually made a strong connection with John Paul II during the conclave that elected John Paul I. And so he was able to kind of come out strongly in support of the election of John Paul II. And John Paul told him immediately, I want you. And he said, listen, I'm a brand new bishop. You got to give me time. And he said, I'll give you time, but I want you here with me. And so he asked him to become head of the Congregation for Education. And Ratzinger said no, actually. And so John Paul said, okay, but listen, you are going to come to Rome. And so I think it was only like a year later. I think it was 1982 when Ratzinger came to work in the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, the CDF, as it was called then. Now it's the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, DDF, but it was CDF throughout Ratzinger's tenure. So he held that position for a very long time, over 20 years, until John Paul's death. And of course, I think he tried to resign 5 times from that position as well. And, and it's like people ask me, why did Benedict resign? I say, well, he wanted to resign for decades. And finally, there was no one to say no to him about his resignation. So, I mean, literally, he kept asking John Paul, can I resign? Can I resign? Can you make me the Vatican librarian? Can you send me to a deserted tropical island? Can I just get out of here, please? And John Paul, and he says this in his what's called the Last Testament, I believe it's called. It's in the interview book that he did with Peter Seewald after his resignation. But he reveals in that interview that John Paul said to him at one point, as long as I am here, you are here. And he said, I didn't ask anymore after that. So I can't remember the exact number. It was like 3 to 5 times he had asked John Paul to resign as head of the CDF. Now, he actually only wrote one book when he was head of the CDF, and that is the Spirit of the Liturgy, which is a title he took from Guardini. So it's a kind of hat tip to Romano Guardini, taking the title of Guardini's earlier book. And that tells us something. Ratzinger made critical comments of the liturgical reform that happened after the Second Vatican Council. And I think his thoughts continued to develop. And by the time he came to Rome, he became seriously convicted that the central crisis facing the church was one of worship. Because what was happening in the culture is that God was being eclipsed. And so what he saw happening in the church is that there was a similar kind of eclipsing of the primacy of God. And I actually wrote a book with the title, The Primacy of God. And I took that title from Benedict because he uses the term either the priority of God or the primacy of God many times. And he would say, that's what the church needs. The church needs to focus on the primacy of God, not the primacy of charitable actions, which are important. In his first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, tries to draw the two together, this primacy of God and how that relates to charitable action. He's not dismissing charitable action. But nonetheless, he's saying that everything that we do in the church will lose meaning if God is not first, if it's not all flowing from and rooted in divine worship. And so I think it's very telling that the only complete book that he wrote in over 20 years in Rome was the spirit of the liturgy.
Hmm.
Now, he issued, I mean, what, 20 other books while he was at the CDF? So what the heck is all that stuff? Well, it's assembling lectures and essays that he wrote both before he went to Rome,
Hmm.
and then also lectures and essays he wrote in Rome, right? So that's the distinction, right? He continued to speak, he continued to write, but in terms of just sitting down and writing one manuscript, it was the spirit of the liturgy. Now, as Pope for 8 years, he wrote 3 books. So he was in Rome for over 20 years and he only wrote 1 book, and then he was Pope for 8 years and he wrote 3 books, all with the same title, Jesus of Nazareth, right? So it's 3 volumes that are really in one set. So you could say, in a sense, he wrote 1 book as Pope as well, Jesus of Nazareth, in 3 volumes.
Well, you could say Lord of the Rings is a book, but
Yeah, it was
same thing.
published in 3 different volumes, but yes,
Hmm.
right,
Yeah. So it makes me think just the fact that he kept wanting to resign and doing and not wanting to be in the Vatican. It sounds a little like Jonah to me, running away from Nineveh, running away from God's calling him to speak to, the people to sort of help, I guess, mend different problems in the church.
It's that's a really wonderful insight. I think, unlike Jonah, Benedict kept saying yes, right?
Hmm.
He didn't want to become Archbishop of Munich, even though Hans Kung accused him of jockeying favor with the Vatican to become a bishop, and that is so far from the truth, right? He really saw that as a cross. He did not want to come to Rome. He didn't like Rome. He didn't want to work in the Roman Curia, right? He accepted that as another cross. And what did he say when he was in the conclave in which he was elected? He said he felt the accumulation of the votes like a guillotine over his head. I mean, he didn't
That's
want to be
crazy.
Pope, right?
Hmm.
But here's the thing: is like, unlike Jonah, he kept saying yes. But I do think you're onto something. What is the first thing that he said when he went out on the balcony? Okay, the first thing he said is, "I am a humble worker in the vineyard." Beautiful, right? It's beautiful, and I think that that's true. That's what he was, right? As a teacher, as bishop, as a Roman official, right? He did not play politics when he was in the Roman Curia. He didn't, right? He just did his own thing, kept his head down, and did a really good job as head of the CDF, and ignored what was all the scandals happening at the Secretary of State. Unfortunately, he did the same thing as Pope, just ignored those
Yeah.
scandals,
Is
at the
that
Secretary of State, and
is
just
that
kept
a
his head down
detriment too?
and did his work. But the second thing he said on the balcony was, "Pray for me that I may not give into fear of the wolves." So what does that say? Right? That there was some kind of internal kind of recoiling at the obstacles that he had to face within the church. And he knew who those wolves were, right? I mean, he worked in the Vatican for over 20 years, right? He knew who would be out to get him. He knew the spiritual and material challenges that he would face as Pope, and he did face them. Now, he said that he did not resign because of any difficulty that he was facing. And in particular, he means the Vatican leaks, right? People trying to undermine his papacy by leaking confidential information. That did not pressure him to resign. He made it very clear, and he even said this before he became Pope, but also during his time as Pope. He said in another interview book with Peter Seewald that if the Pope felt incapable of fulfilling his duties, he had an obligation to resign the papacy. And so he claims very clearly that the only reason that he resigned the papacy was because he felt unable to fulfill the duties of the office. Now, some people will point out, because some of the examples he gave, like my doctor told me I couldn't do any more international travel, right? And in his conception of how the papacy needed to operate in the modern world was that the popes now have to travel all the time.
Yeah, I'm like, okay, I don't need you to travel. I
Yeah, I
think
mean, I
most
think a
people.
lot of us would say that. Just sit in the Vatican. Like, that's what the popes used to do in the past, and he knew that.
Hmm.
He knew that there were plenty of popes. I mean, Pius XII had a very long decline, you know, and Paul VI had a number of years of decline, when a very quiet papacy. And just about every other pope throughout history had that period of decline at the end of their papacy. John Paul II did. And actually, he says that watching the decline of John Paul II made him not want to do that as pope. So that's actually was part of it. He said, okay, I know what it's like from the sidelines, at least, of watching a pope deteriorate in office. And I don't want to go through that. I don't want to put the church through that, right? Because he knows the Secretary of State just kind of grabbed the reins and took over when John Paul was incapacitated. And he didn't want that to happen.
Don't people look at John Paul II's decline as an example of holiness, though?
Absolutely. Right. It was a great witness. But Ratzinger, I mean, you could say that John Paul II was a great performer. I remember seeing him at World Youth Day in Toronto, and he was already pretty incapacitated, but there he was up on the platform spinning his cane, you know, in the air over and over and over again, because that was the most dramatic thing that he could do. And he was a performer, right? And I don't mean that in any kind of disingenuous way. What I mean is he was an actor, literally, right? He wanted to be an actor as his vocation, and then he discerned his entrance into the priesthood. And so there is a way in which, and I mean this in a positive sense, not a negative one, that he really was performing for the world. And Benedict performed in that sense much better than anyone, I think, thought that he would. Did, the Wednesday audiences decline under Benedict? No, they increased under Benedict. Like, more people came to hear him talk than actually came to John Paul II's Wednesday audiences. Well, because they were probably the best Wednesday audiences ever given, and that maybe ever will be given. I don't know. I mean, we'll see what's in store. But people flocked to Benedict. He had a very different kind of charisma. But when I'm comparing him to John Paul II, I mean that he did not want to perform in the public eye. He was an extremely private person. And so I think he was mortified at the thought of the world watching him decline. Now, in some sense, we did anyway, right? Now, I mean, he was hiding out, and in his little monastery, right? That John Paul II built for the nuns, which he took over. He was kind of hiding out there, for almost 10 years. And so we couldn't, he wasn't in the public eye nearly as much as he would have been as Pope, but we were still kind of watching him step by step. But he was mortified at the thought of everyone having that much attention on his decline as John Paul II did.
Where did Pope Emeritus, the title, and sort of was still wearing the papal white, come from?
Archbishop Gainsfine. And Benedict literally said, I wanted to be called Father Benedict. But he says, I did not have the strength to insist. And what does that mean? He felt that incapacitated that he just turned over those details to Archbishop Gainsfine to make those decisions for him, right? His secretary, who's coming. I mean, we could have another podcast because Gainsfine's coming out with a book this week, giving his perspective on the pontificate of Benedict and the whole retirement. So that'll be a whole nother topic of conversation. But Gainsfine is the one who orchestrated all that stuff.
Yeah, it just seems to me it's hard for me to imagine, and it's not because I don't have sympathy or something, but it's hard for me to imagine it because even to me, if I was really old and dying slowly, I'd be I'd be indignant. I would be like, no, I want it this way. I want it how I think that comes from much more of a melancholic. It seems like Pope Benedict was a phlegmatic. Is that a good estimation? He seems very much sort of passive in the at least in his default. I'm very much, I would want something to be the ideal, and he seems to want everyone to be he wants the ideal, but he's willing to work with people, I guess.
You're Irish, of course, right?
Yes.
And so, Yeah, I mean he's German. I'm not. I don't know if I would say he's phlegmatic because I guess I didn't know him enough personally.
Sure.
I think you can see the melancholic in him. So,
Okay.
um, but so I wouldn't say that he's passive. I would not say that, but I would say he was gentle, that he was humble, but very strong. I mean, he was not one to back down. And even when you get a case like, what did Cardinal Casper do? He signed that joint declaration with the Lutherans, and Casper, he snuck that thing through without Ratzinger having any input. So what did Ratzinger do? He didn't back down. He issued a clarification after the signature. And he said, "Oh, no, no, on behalf of the Catholic Church, I'm clarifying what this document actually meant and what it can and can't do." That's not passive. That's very strong, you know?
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I mean, when he was asked, how many documents did you write as head of the CDF? He said, none. Meaning that it was not about his voice. He did not come into the Vatican and say, this is about me. I'm going to direct everything. I'm going to push everything. He was very collaborative, and he really drew out the contribution of others. He relied on others even when he couldn't rely on them. So Cardinal Bertone, he was a longtime collaborator with Pope Benedict at the CDF. And so therefore Benedict made him Secretary of State, even though he was wholly unqualified to be Secretary of State. And he continued to depend upon him even when he showed himself to be undependable. And so that tells us something about him, that he was very loyal, but when he entrusted somebody with something, he entrusted it to them, and he wasn't going to interfere. But he was very strong when he needed to be. When you look at Summorum Pontificum, that was strong. When you look at Anglicanorum Cedibus, was establishing the Anglican Ordinariates, that was very strong. The lifting of the excommunications of the SSPX, even though that was botched, nonetheless, that was a strong gesture. And so Benedict he's difficult to read. I mean, Pope Francis is much more of an enigma, right? And Pope Francis is very contradictory. But when you look at Benedict, there is not in the same way, but you would say that he could be very strong, very insistent upon certain points that things be done the right way, and yet sometimes too much deference to others. And even when somebody betrayed him, he would continue to trust them, even when he probably should have replaced them. But in my mind, that just comes back to his very gentle and humble nature, but maybe even stubborn at some points. Like,
Yeah.
I made a decision and I'm going to stick with it. I do even think that his stubborn loyalty to Bertone, and this is in my analysis, is one of the reasons of his resignation, is that I don't think he could coast into a declining papacy with Bertone making a mess of things at the Secretary of State. Now, it's probably worse at the Secretary of State now, but that's a whole nother story, Um,
Yeah.
and so he didn't have enough people surrounding him at the Vatican that he could trust. And with his declining health, did he feel like he could replace them? No, he didn't feel like he could replace the people who were failing him. Um, and so I think, therefore, he replaced himself. That's my take. I never even put that down in writing, but I've shared that with many people, and
It's an interesting strategy.
only Benedict
Um,
would do that. But
yeah. So to clarify what I said, I guess it's probably his personality was probably somewhere between melancholic, phlegmatic, at least. And what I mean by passive, I don't mean that he was passive. I mean that he may have been inclined to be passive, but that he would go out of his way to not be passive when he thought it was important. And, so that's kind of what I mean by that.
yeah,
So,
I guess I would just as I was trying to just clarify, maybe passive isn't the right word.
okay.
Word from our affiliate, Bishop Sheen Rosaries. You've probably worn through the chain of your cheap plastic rosary. Other rosaries simply can't stand up to the wear and tear of everyday life. Bishop Sheen rosaries are made of solid metal beads and paracord to withstand any condition and are backed with a lifetime warranty. Upgrade your rosary to a Bishop Sheen rosary made to fit your lifestyle or buy one for a friend. Each rosary sold supplies 2 weeks of food for a school kid in Uganda. You use the exclusive link down below to help support our efforts here at Plotlines. The link will take you to sheenrosaries.com. Be sure to use the code Plotlines10.
But because he was so gentle and humble, it could
Mhm.
seem sometimes like he was being passive.
Okay. Yeah, that kinda is a phlegmatic trait, is that they uh, seem that way.
Yeah. So I
Okay.
see where you're coming from. Yeah, with that insight. Yeah.
So what do you think is the biggest, like, event of Pope Benedict's papacy?
Well, I suppose in some ways people would say the resignation.
Well, does that count, kind of? Because it's the
Yes,
I
because
mean
it was a decision of his papacy.
okay,
Now, I'm not going to say that. Okay,
okay.
I've already mentioned, I think, what are the two biggest ones, which I see together actually. And that's Summorum Pontificum and the issuing of Anglicanorum Cedibus. I do like to think of them together, um, because they both very much relate to the liturgy and to the preservation of a patrimony, although in different ways. And so I think they're an interesting contrast. Now, I think Summorum is significant not just because it liberalized the celebration of Latin Mass. And I think that's what a lot of people would focus on. And they would say, okay, so, Pope Benedict enabled us to have the Latin Mass more readily. Yeah, true. But I think that Summorum is much bigger than that. And that's why it's hated so much right now. Because I think what Paul VI wanted people to think and what Pope Francis wants people to think is that what happened after Vatican II in those crazy years of the 1960s leading up to the promulgation of the Novus Ordo and at the beginning of Advent, 1969, that is definitive and that the case is closed. And so in my mind, it's not just about celebrating the Latin Mass over in one corner. Like you guys just go off and celebrate the Latin Mass. I think that Summorum, in a much deeper way, is saying the way that we worship, whether it is the new Mass or the old Mass, the way that we worship needs to be rooted in an unbroken continuity of the liturgical life of the church. And Benedict really did think that there was a rupture following the Second Vatican Council. Some of it officially on paper, and of course, some of it just unofficially in the kind of revolution that happened
How does that
alongside
work
of the
how does
official.
that work with or hermeneutic of continuity? Because usually I've heard people say rupture and hermeneutic of continuity kind of as opposites, or possibly
Well, it's
getting
the hermeneutic of continuity, and then Benedict contrasted that to the hermeneutic of disrupture and discontinuity. Um, so I think what he said, and that was at a Christmas address to the Curia when he talked about the two different hermeneutics for the Second Vatican Council. I do think that the liturgy is probably the most important element of the proper hermeneutic of continuity. And so that is essentially what I'm saying. What
Mhm.
Summorum was a huge stroke in favor of the hermeneutic of continuity.
Okay.
And Summorum did improve the Novus Ordo. You can see that in so many ways, right? That there was an increase of priests celebrating Ad Orientem. You began to see, according to Benedict's own example, an altar cross prominently placed on the altar, along with, candlesticks as well.
Mhm.
You began to just see a more faithful, more formal expression of the liturgy. And so, once again, even though I would applaud, the the moves in favor of the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass, I do think that Summorum was even bigger than that. I mean, obviously that was a huge element of it, but it was bigger, right? For this hermeneutic of continuity for the liturgy, basically saying we need to regain lost continuity. We need to regain the organic continuity of the liturgy, which was ruptured. So I think that is crucial. Now, the church's liturgical life is broader than the Roman Rite. I mean, even in the West, you have the Ambrosian Rite, and then of course we have the Byzantine liturgy, Syriac, and etc. And I think what Benedict did with the Anglicans is utterly fascinating. Basically saying there's great irony here, that there is a place in the church's diverse liturgical tradition, even for Protestant expressions of the liturgy, which in this case of Anglicanorum Cedibus happened to be more traditional than the Novus Ordo. And, to me, it's all part of the movement of Summorum. That's why I was saying, is put these together. Because I think what he's saying is, what do we need to recover in the liturgy? It's not just a hermeneutic of continuity for continuity's sake, but that the whole tradition of the liturgy is about how we relate to God. And so the primacy of God. And Anglicanorum was a stroke of genius of saying, I want to draw more people to the truth. I want to draw more people to God. And so I'm willing to take this very bold move, which of course was something that the English bishops were even against, and others were against as well. And so I think he really, in both cases, put himself out there very boldly. And I think at the end of the day, both moves are trying to draw people to reunite broken pieces of the tradition and to move forward in this really God-centered way.
Yeah. No, it's I have not yet had the privilege to attend uh a Anglican ordinariate mass, which I would say it's one of the things that I'd really like to do in the future. It's not really around. Uh, the Midwest does not have many Anglican ordinariates, if I'm not mistaken. But it does seem like there's this sort of liturgical tradition that kind of at least was lessened when the Novus Ordo was sort of simplified with sort of this sort of more like something like the Dominican rite disappeared as well as from being practiced as much. I don't know how often the Carmelite rite was practiced, but the Ambrosian rite is pretty much just a Milanese thing, isn't it? It's not
Yes.
really
Yeah.
celebrated outside.
Right.
So to have these two sort of two rites up or two different missals, I guess, would they become part of the same rite in some sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I mean, the Anglican ordinariate is part of the Roman Rite, and there is some controversy about whether the Ambrosian Rite is a derivation of the Roman Rite or an expression of the old Gallican Rite or something even distinct from that. So, but I mean, nonetheless, we would say that they're all liturgies of the Latin Church.
Hmm.
But nonetheless, the ordinariate is a use within the Roman Rite.
Yeah. So just this sort of diversity within the Roman rite. Really do see what you're saying regarding how the Summum Pontificum and the Anglican Ordinariate really made the Novus Ordo uh, more traditional. Though interesting enough, I saw it more under during Francis's pontificate and not really under Benedict's. And I think that might have just been because younger priests were coming along, at least where I was. But anyways, it's definitely an interesting vision. I'm not sure how it can play out as much now with with Benedict when he resigned and when Pope Francis took over and sort of um, at least from appearance cut the legs underneath Summum Pontificum.
Well, that will be interesting to see how that all develops. Francis said that he wants the celebration of the Latin Mass to die out. That doesn't mean that it will. That is his desire, and we will see what God's providence has in store. I think it would be very difficult to get rid of the Anglican ordinariate at this point as well. I would really hope to see it grow. I've heard that the biggest concern amongst many Anglicans, I think, is actually contraception. It keeps a lot of people, I think, out of the Catholic Church, but I do think there's huge potential there. And I know Francis is not interested in this at the time being, but Lutherans actually have even reached out to the Vatican to say, can there be other ordinariates? I mean, can we incorporate elements of the Lutheran tradition into the Catholic Church? And wow, I don't know. I mean, so there could be a huge potential here in the future for growth in the Anglican ordinariate, and then possibly for other ordinariates to emerge.
Is it just me, or does it sort of for like the Anglican ordinariate is a less changed version of the Mass back because the Reformation was so different for the English versus the Germans. Would that be is that I guess would their liturgy be close enough?
It's very interesting. Archbishop Cranmer was a validly ordained Catholic priest, and on the surface, a validly ordained Catholic bishop as well. And he is the one who wrote the foundation of the Book of Common Prayer. And of course, there's other edits that happen through the ages as well. And so Cranmer was adapting the Roman Rite, and of course there was the Sarum use in England that was present in some places, not all places in England. And so it was an adaptation of the Roman Rite. And so now there's an adaptation of that adaptation to reunite it back to the Catholic Church. So very fascinating, right? And so when Benedict said there was an Anglican patrimony that could be preserved within the Catholic Church, a lot of people said, well, what in the world is that? You know what I mean? Because they had the Catholic Church and then they changed it for the worse. So what would you want to bring back from that? Well, I mean, there were particular liturgical texts and devotions that arose in the Anglican tradition. Even Cranmer's English, it has become part of that tradition. And so those are the things that will be preserved there. But ultimately, they're derived from the Roman Rite itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what? So you said that Pope Benedict, when he resigned, it wasn't from fleeing from the wolves, right?
I mean, what he has said is that he resigned because of his advanced age and weakness, and he felt he was incapable of fulfilling his responsibilities as Pope. So I don't think he was coerced by fear, feeling like he had to flee from something. I'm just going to take him at his word. I don't think he was a liar, and so he said, I did not resign out of fear of some problem or fear of coercion or anything like that. But I mean, he certainly, and anyone would. I mean, Francis has his enemies and critics, and Benedict had his, and that's true for every pope.
Yeah. Did he take inspiration? I think it's from Pope Celestine V. I think he was the last pope prior to resign.
Yes, apart from the Great Western Schism, right? Because of course we had resignations related to the schism, but a lot of people do look back to Celestine. And actually, Gamesfind clarified that that he left his pallium at the tomb of Celestine V. And Gainsfine, and this is an excerpt that came out from the book that is being released. So his secretary said that he left the pallium because he didn't like the pallium.
What?
Is that it was John Paul's old pallium and it weighed too heavily on his shoulders. I'm sure there's a metaphor there for something. And he thought
Okay.
that it would be a beautiful gesture to leave his pallium there. Now, okay, let's take Gainsfine's explanation at face value. Great. It was a handy way to get rid of his pallium. And so he could have the Greek pallium that he wanted to have, which was red crosses instead of John Paul's black crosses and that kind of stuff. Fine. It still seems to be a prophetic gesture, right?
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
mean, if he wanted to resign that many times as prefect of the CDF and he didn't want to be Pope, and he didn't feel like he was coerced into being Pope, but like this was a huge responsibility that he accepted, this guillotine coming down over his head. He may have had thoughts even at the beginning, like, gosh, I'll do this for as long as I can, I'm projecting this, but I mean, it would just make sense given his history. Gosh, I'll do this as long as I can. And so how could he not think about that when he's at Celestine's tomb, which he visited twice as Pope? And so the pallium, sure, okay, maybe he ditched his pallium because he wanted to ditch it, and it was a beautiful gesture. But there's got to be something there too. So obviously, and what was Celestine was a monk who became Pope, didn't really want to become Pope, but was trying to help the church out of a very difficult situation. And so I'm
Dante put
sure.
him in hell.
Well, no, and he put him outside of hell,
Oh, really?
chased by bees, right? So, I mean, it's kind of, he said it wasn't even bad enough to go to hell because,
Oh.
just of his, kind of shirking his responsibilities, right? So he has to run, around the entrance of hell. So,
That's funny. But yeah, okay. And then, so how do you think Pope Benedict has influenced your work?
oh, very, very profoundly. Like I said, I am a Thomist theologian. But my dissertation director Matthew Levering came up with this term that some people think is an oxymoron, but ressourcement Thomism. And I think that it's important, right? Because Thomas himself was a great biblical scholar. I mean, that was his job to teach the sacred page to his students. And so I think there's been great work that's been done in the recent decades of drawing out the biblical dimensions of Thomas's theology, of drawing out his dependence upon the church fathers, and really trying to learn, not just, kind of repeating Thomas's thinking, but following his method today. And even though Benedict was not a great Thomist, he appreciated Thomas in his own right. It's not one of his favorite theologians, fine, but I actually have an article to say that the one area where he quotes Thomas the most is actually on biblical hermeneutics. So you can look that up in Nova Vetera if you're interested in that article. But I would say that Benedict, for me, is just a great model of how to do theology in service of the church, rooted in the sources, trying to speak into the needs of the church right now, in a spirit of dialogue. I know that dialogue sounds like wishy-washy to people, but what that really means is I'm interested in what other people are saying and what they're thinking, and drawing from the tradition of the church. I want to have a conversation about that, and so Benedict wants to talk to people. He wants to listen to people. And I think that is a great way of doing theology. So, like I said, I named a book of Thomist theology on the virtue of religion after a phrase from Pope Benedict, the primacy of God. And so I bring Thomas, Ratzinger, and von Balthasar kind of together in dialogue in my book, The Primacy of God. And so that's a great example for me of just kind of drawing upon the themes from Benedict's pontificate, that we have to be rooted in God's revelation, that God's revelation is primary for theology, that we can only talk about God because he's spoken to us. It's very important for me, right? And so that my work in theology is a response to God speaking to me. And so that is a dialogue, right? So like I said, I don't like cheesy dialogues, but there's a profound sense of dialogue. that theology itself is relational with God, and we don't do theology in a vacuum. And it's meant to be relational with other people, that we are really drawn into a real conversation about the things that matter most through theology. I'm also a Benedictine oblate, and we talked a bit about that when we talked about the beer option, because it's rooted in the Benedict option.
Mm-hmm.
And so my most recent piece of scholarship on Pope Benedict was Pope Benedict on the Benedictine mission to evangelize culture. So kind of looking at Pope Benedict's own rooting in the Benedictine tradition. And part of that is, goes back to the word of God, that the Benedictines are rooted in Lectio Divina. So they're praying with the scripture and God's revelation. But the Benedictine life is also very liturgical. And so I would say that Benedict's theology has really rooted me very deeply in the liturgy as a theologian, not just as a Catholic, not just as a Benedictine oblate, but as a theologian. And I think it's therefore makes my spiritual life, my life as an oblate, my life as a theologian complementary, because they're all rooted in the liturgy. And so he is a great witness. And I think that's why he chose the name Benedict, is because he saw that affinity with Saint Benedict and the great Benedictine tradition.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I will links in the description to your books. Is there anything you want to send people? Any place you want to send people to look for your stuff?
Yeah, so my website is buildingcatholicculture.com. So you can kind of follow me through my website. I also have a new book coming out within the next month or so. So by the end of February, How the Eucharist Can Save Civilization. And you can count on a bunch of Ratzinger quotes in that book. So those are just two places. You can also, I write a syndicated column that comes out 2 times a month, and Catholic World Report is one of the places where that's syndicated. So you can also see my regular column at Catholic World Report.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Staudt, for
Mm-hmm.
enlightening us on Benedict's legacy. I learned a lot, and it's always fascinating talking to you.
Thank you. It's always great to talk to you as well.
Thank you, everyone, for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And thank you all for watching. Have a blessed day. Bye.